It seems that the concert was really too late because people are still sleeping, maybe, I don't know. Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy again to be here in this context of the symposium. And as everybody knows, I love to work here at this institute because I like the orientation which has developed mainly by my two friends, Anatai and JD. This morning I would like to speak about recent artistic developments in Bali and with the connection with the political situation, music in the realm of myth and realities in Bali. I have divided that in 4 parts. First, Bali's history between the myth of being a paradise and reality. Second, the role of tourism. Third, the problem of music education. And fourth, representative examples of new music in Bali, borrowing, transforming, inventing. In 1989, in Singapore and America, Peri Plus Editions published Adrian Vicker's sensational book called Bali, a Paradise Created. In 1995, it was followed by the anthropologist Geoffrey Robinson with his publication, The Dark Side of the Paradise, Political Violence in Bali. Both titles make use of the term paradise, but with a negative connotation, and both books triggered quite controversial reactions. However, the unbelievable idealization, the mythos of Bali or of the Balinese, is unparalleled in the world, especially if one considers Bali's political history and geographic dimensions. How does someone from the Western world, for example from Germany, becomes acquainted with Bali? In most cases, I think it will be by advertising magazines or travel agencies. There's hardly one that does not include Bali in its portfolio. Here is the front page of a representative magazine from the ADAC, which is the German Mobile Club. And the title page shows the portrait of a young female dancer with makeup, which is apparently portraying Asian gracefulness and a directly appealing dance. I'm not sure whether the girl really knew why she was photographed. And why is it always a female dancer and not a male one? It continues with the main titles. Bali, the gentle soul of Asia, followed by some subtitles. Top beaches and hotels. Visit the king. Disco fever in Kuta. Trekking in Lombok. As a matter of fact, Balinese culture is clearly not of any importance here. All this is presented with an exotic touch, but ultimately in a familiar and comfortable setting for Westerners. It is also in concordance with the image that the Indonesian government and even a lot of the Balinese wish to present. After all, Bali is an important, if not the most important source for foreign currencies, and by far the most important in the region of the Indonesian tourist industry. However, this picture seems to be in complete contradiction with the above-mentioned book titles. Adrian Vickers comments, "Such is the island's image of crowded splendor, an artistic people in harmony with nature, a vibrant erotic atmosphere and an exotic ancient history. More than any other tropical island, Bali has become the most exotic of exotic locations. Over 3 centuries, the West has constructed a complex and gorgeous image of the island that has become to take over even Balinese thought." End the quote. Vickers' quote describes perfectly the popular image of Bali in the West. However, he also points to that artificially created element. Already at the beginning of his book, Geoffrey Robinson writes, "In the wake of an Indonesian military coup in October 1965, the island of Bali erupted in political violence in which an estimated 80,000 people, or roughly 5% of the population, died. In its intensity and in the proportion of the population killed, the violence on Bali probably exceeded that witnessed on Java in the same period. The populations of whole villages were executed. The victims either shot with automatic weapons or hacked to death with knives and machetes. Some of the killers were said to have drunk the blood of their victims or to have gloated over the numbers of people they had put to death. End of the quote. During my studies in 1981-82, I was still able to meet someone from Blabato, this Kenya region, named Igusti Nyurabagos, who was supposed to be one of the main killers in the region during the time. Surprisingly, he was highly respected, especially and significantly for the Jalanarang performance. He was called the master of black magic, which means a lot in Bali. Apparently, my village Sabah had even the reputation to be a place for black magic, and near the Puradalam, this temple that shows to the sea, it was said there is a mass graveyard from that time. But also the 200 years before the massacre were signified by political violence, not to speak about the final establishing of the colonial power by the Dutch at the beginning of the 20th century. During pre-colonial Bali, there was a constant state of political rivalries between the princes with other nobles, and Robinson writes about that. In 1633, a Dutch delegation failed in their attempt to contact the Balinese to win allies against the Javanese kingdom Mataram. The Balinese had not been interested to determine their political interests based on religion. The primary and overall positive image that Bali had for Europeans, although the Balinese will still be regarded as wild and exotic people, turned continuously into the negative. And it will last another 250 years until this notion will turn around again into the opposite. During the time, the 17th until the 19th century, Balinese nobles had been continuously on the move. Their favorite hobby was an almost uninterrupted state of war. No wonder that foreign observers looked at Bali with a certain suspicion and uncertainty. We know about ongoing intrigues and martial disputes between the respective principalities and even within some noble families themselves. On the other hand, there was still that rich culture and obviously a harmonious consciousness in life. These inner Balinese disputes were even fueled by the irrational and disjoint behavior of the Dutch colonizers. It was not before 1908 that the Dutch succeeded in controlling Bali as a whole. It began in 1906 with the famous Puputan in Badung, today's Denpasar, and later as well in Tabanan. A Puputan is a ritual mass suicide, in that case led by the Raja of Badung, who went out with about 800 people from his court, and they went in front of the Dutch, and they all killed themselves with a kris at that time. The following establishment of the Dutch colonial government happened in the same way as the Dutch had already practiced before in Java. You may call that indirect governance. This means that the Dutch collaborated with the local kings. These nobles could keep their respective status and additionally organize, or better extracted, all the taxes from the society for the Dutch. The next inner political problem was created through an encompassing land reform by the Dutch. Divisions and allocations of land were executed following criteria that the Dutch regarded as efficient for the administration, regardless of the actual Balinese situation itself and the traditions. By that time, some nobles were able to increase their influence and wealth, while others decreased and became impoverished. People of the administration that opposed the Dutch were quickly removed and exchanged with Dutch-friendly Balinese. As this happened almost on a weekly basis without notification, internal unrest under the Balinese was again a natural and inevitable development. What the Dutch had constructed in favor of a conservation of tradition was in effect the creation of a new hierarchic order, legalized and ideologically secured by the colonial power. Because of this, new tensions were soon to be expected. At the same time, the image of Bali as the exotic paradise emerged. Since the 1920s, a growing number of anthropologists, ethnologists, and artists came to Bali, like, for example, Margaret Mead, anthropologist Gregory Bateson and Jane Belo, the composer, pianist Colin McPhee, and the German painter Walter Spies, just to name a few, who were responsible for that growing mythos of a peaceful paradise. They soon attracted the attention of the upper class of America and Europe, who, with the support of these people, came to Bali and visited this new putative paradise, the birth of tourism. Well, I'm asking myself, how was it possible that those visitors did not come in contact with all that political turmoil of the time? And how was this small circle of individualists able to establish and maintain that mythos of a paradise, and which, obviously, often very personal reasons were behind it? In Adrian Vicker's book, which I really can recommend, some chapters sound like a thorough crime thriller. The breakdown of the Dutch colonial regime and the takeover by the Japanese in 1942 did not cause any significant change of the situation. The Japanese were easily able just to take over the Dutch structures for their own system. After the Second World War and the defeat of the Japanese, the Dutch shortly returned to Bali, but in 1949 they were finally expelled from the island. But the price was very high. As far as I know, more than 2,000 Balinese lost their lives during that final struggle. And you still remember, if you come to Bali, there was nearly this statue of Ngurah Rai. He was the general who was leading the Balinese against the Dutch at that time. And the airport is still called Ngurah Rai until today. However, independence did not end the local rivalries. All the hidden tensions regarding political influence continued under the surface. Finally, they broke out again in a more uncontrolled and intensified way after the 1965 coup. For example, the North Bali village of Kediskaja was completely eradicated, which had serious consequences for the development of music. One of the leading composers of that time, of the new Kepia style, called Merdana, had lived there and did not survive the killings. So until today, for many people, the piece Hujan Mas, very famous Kepia piece, is always connected with Pliatan because they made the piece popular in the West, but it was actually composed from this Merdana in Kediskaja, who was then killed. But it was not only the situation in '65 itself that could explain why Bali had to experience such unusual massacres. There's another reason why that coup in '65 had such extreme consequences. The Indonesian Communist Party, PKI of that time, had gained growing influence in the previous years. They also began another aggressive land reform that led to the expropriation of many traditional landowners. As the local custom right adat is of almost religious importance for the Balinese, the unrest by such decisions can be easily imagined. Only when we take this complex situation into account, the special political situation for Bali can be understood, at least partly. It is more concrete and more realistic compared with all those myths. In the light of political reality, paradise-like exotic images of Bali were a mere fata morgana, and the Balinese knew precisely that something had influenced their important cosmic balance. Before we look back to the recent years, I would also like to mention various political influences on the development of Balinese music. Under Sukarno, first president of Indonesia, Bali profited quite well, perhaps because his mother was Balinese, and tourism developed, and Sukarno did not hesitate to present Bali as the Indonesian emerald when he had guests of honor. But he also tried to influence Balinese music, at least during the late 1950s. As a socialist, his ideas of music followed this idea of presenting the reality, the working people, and he was less interested in all these feudal art forms like gamelan gambu or sama pegulingan. He asked for what I call social realistic dances, and this was a time when almost on the spot the Balinese started for their president to compose pieces like Tari Nelayan, the Fisher's Dance, Tari Tenun, the Weaver's Dance, and so on and so on. If you hear this piece musically, there's always the same structure, and you always just have these realistic things going on stage in the dance. Very boring. But the thing is, I say very boring, not because of myself. The Balinese themselves didn't like it. Yeah? But they just said, okay, we can make money with it, fine, so we do it. In the late 1960s, Balinese artists apparently started to think more artistically again, and it was mainly triggered by the rebirth of those famous gamelan competitions between the principalities. And the late Iwayan Brata from Denpasar was the leading composer and most influential one at that time for that new Kepia style. And he created a model which was called Kreasi Baru, the Indonesian word which easily can be translated as new creation. After a prolonged period, that model became the standard for the competitions. And it needed again some time until young composers like Nyoman Winda, Wayan Yudana, or Komang Astita risked to going further. It does not mean that it was impossible to make creative pieces with that Kreasi Baru model, especially Wayan Brata himself or Gede Asnawan, for example. They proved that this is possible. We will hear an example later. But after 2 decades, the model was regarded as being too normative. A next political issue was initiated by a former director of the Balinese Art Academy, ISI, in Denpasar. He again started to go back and promoted this ill-fated realistic style of programmatic dances. But at that time, it was now only for the sake of tourism. And then you had these pieces which if you have been there, maybe seen, Mano Gravo, this birds dance, or the disco-like Kijang Kenjana, the deer dance. So a lot of animals came into being, and you heard all these dances where the girls came out with this kind of weaving stuff. And the next dance, exactly the same, just the costume has changed. And the last political setback, although a typical Balinese one, happened in 2008-09, and the smoke of those events have not yet disappeared until today. It happened exclusively at the leading art academy ISI in Denpasar. The rector lost when he was supposed to be re-elected by the Senate for a second term, and suddenly he declared this election, because he lost, for illegal. Good technique. He dismissed the whole Senate and exchanged its members with his own peers. In the end, when the election was repeated, he was re-elected. The reasons behind this Hollywood-like story are too complex to be presented here. But obviously, he was backed up by the Ministry of Higher Education, Dikti, in Jakarta. The whole affair then started to be filled up with intrigues, protests, and it really became an internationally known issue, at least in the gamelan scene. Finally, 3 main teachers had been discharged with dishonor, losing status, losing anything, and this was something, they were, so to speak, misused by the rector. We call that in Germany a Bauernopfer. Don't know how I should translate that. Peasant's victim, if I translate it literally. I don't find the word. Again, how could such polarizing images come into being? The paradise on one side and continuous and often aggressive unrest on the other side. Nobody can deny that Bali is a beautiful island with a diverse nature, a highly developed, artistically rich culture, as well as a complex ritual life. The traditional agrarian culture and the village life, based on a complex system of rules, are quite unique in the world. Even the so-called harmony within the society apparently exists, at least on the surface. It seems that the totality of all aspects is of utmost importance in the social context. It enables positive and negative aspects at the same time, which seems to be difficult to understand for a Westerner. Ultimately, it is the target of every single person to be in harmony and balance with the gods or nature, just for one's own sake. And this is also represented by the importance of the coordinates mountain, sea, sunrise, sunset. A human being is always in the center and has always to contribute to all sides to secure his or her own welfare. Alfred Bühler summarized that, saying, "On this as well as on the other side, those phenomena go back to the unpredictable, back to forces that first are regarded as special attributes of certain objects, manifestations and processes. Such a basic attitude of mankind towards the world is called magic. Over centuries, manifold influences have shaped the complex culture and life consciousness. The Balinese have a natural talent to ignore influences from outside, as well as transforming and integrating those influences into their own cosmos. And they do that consciously as well as unconsciously. To speak of a closed system of religious belief and doctrine, the dream of every ethnologist, is not appropriate. The Balinese are real champions in unifying the most contrasting elements. In their associative thinking, it is easily possible to see completely different or opposing things as manifestations of the same origin. But it is the ongoing desire of the Balinese to keep those polar forces in balance. Was Ramsaya Rhodes? Balinese religion is ultimately a system of objective obligation towards the forces of nature, the gods, the souls of ancestors, demons and other people. One will search in vain for fervently praying believers. The Balinese system of belief has no reason for sentimental religiosity, as it is so typical for other religions all over the world. End of the quote. No wonder that there is also no real word for art, at least until recently. However, if one speaks about art during the last years, if nowadays the Balinese call themselves artists, and they really should, then these are terms after having contact with non-Balinese people, and after Balinese artists had learned what it means in the West. In the traditional sense, there are actually three basic meanings in Bali in relation to art. Art production is social behavior and is expected and sanctioned on a social level. Art production is ritual, religious behavior, and is expected and sanctioned on transcendental or spiritual level. Art production is educational behavior and is important in the sense of socialization within one's social group since birth. And here's the point, to get back to tourism. It started, as we have already seen, in the 1920s, and until today has achieved a size that cannot be called healthy anymore. It started in the Badung area with the two villages Sanur and Kuta, and shortly after with the so-called Artists Center in Ubud and its surroundings. Today the whole southeast coast is plastered with hotels, homestays, shops, restaurants. Even Ubud and its vicinities resemble more a tourist business center rather than a place for artists. Similar developments happened on the north coast and around some mountain resorts near the big lakes. The most significant tourist enclave, Balinese Disney World maybe, I don't know, is the large Nusa Dua complex on the southern peninsula with the same name. Bali is occupied by an enormous network of the tourist industry. However, the problems soon began although perhaps not as we might expect because of cultural alienation. This was never an issue for the Balinese. Let me name some of the real consequences. Many Balinese came into serious debt when they sold their land after they have seen the economic growth of some of their neighbors. They want to jump onto the wagon of such quick success. But they did not realize that the tourist business has also its natural limitations. After a short time span, prestigious new buildings became useless. Social structures and networks in the villages were disrupted because of the collective fieldwork was not possible anymore. Gamelan orchestras that traditionally played during village rituals were often confronted with the conflict between fulfilling the hotel contract and the traditional duties in their respective villages. Furthermore, important and fertile parts of the island were destroyed in favor of new streets and hotels. High-ranked state officials and military generals have started quite early to buy, or better confiscate, most of the coastal land to sell or rent to the hotel businesses. Unfortunately, it included some questionable lawsuits as well. Based on their traditional and non-written adat law, the Balinese have their own rights of ownership and usage. But most of them cannot prove it with written documents. Consequently, forced dislocations created social tensions, and the offered purchase prices by those high-ranked officials from Jakarta were nothing more than a mere pittance. A last problem is the complex and existential water supply. Over centuries, the Balinese have developed a sophisticated and extremely efficient water distribution irrigation system, the Subak, starting from the big mountain lakes and supplying the whole island. Today, that system seems to have almost collapsed because thousands of hotels have caused an increased consumption of water, and the whole agrarian system is currently in extreme danger. But you won't read about that in the newspapers normally. To my knowledge, so far, the necessary countermeasures have not yet been initiated. Finally, but also as a starting point, I would like to say some words on music education in Indonesia, both on an academic as well as on a public school level. This is my field of work actually since more or less 1989, and myth and reality are even more obvious in this minefield. It began for me with the, at that time, 12-year-old son of my guest family in the 80s. At that time, the boy was already a professional gamelan player who joined every gamelan activity in the village. And one day he approached me quite shy and asked for some help. And he showed me his small booklet from the school where I could recognize a D-flat major scale. D-flat major scale. Neatly written in Western notation. When I asked him what that should mean, he answered, that is exactly what you want to know from me. Because the teacher has written that on the blackboard and that this is the theory of music and he has to memorize it. Full stop. I don't remember how many red lights started to flash at once, but this experience triggered an approaching avalanche of further experiences and activities. And here it is necessary to know that during the foundation of the nation in the 40s and 50s, there were two parties in Indonesia opposing each other. There were the modernists who said the future in Indonesia can only lie in behavior towards the West, to adapt everything that comes from the West. There was the other side who said, no, it's just the opposite. We have to rely on our own traditions, like Kihaja Dewantara and in the music scene, and we have to develop our own music culture. This time, this debate, which by the way is still going on until today, I think, was called at that time Polemik Kebudayaan, cultural polemics, and it was really something very famous, which, as I said, still active, relevant in Indonesia today. And here we are, again back at our D-flat major scale. From its very beginning in the late 1940s, the whole music education in formal schools has dealt with Western music theory, or what was mostly understood as such. Even in remote areas and from high-class artistic gamelan orchestras, young generations had to memorize the circle of fifths, as well as the number of symphonies composed by Beethoven. Also, they have never heard one, nor did they understand anything about that musical language. And they were further tortured with Western notation, which even most of their teachers did not really understand. Why did that absurd and ultimately state-controlled alienation happen? This goes back until the beginnings of the school system during the colonial period. The school system was mostly developed by Dutch missionaries, and their interest was less a comprehensive education in music, but the conversion of the poor savage people to become Christian. Until today, I cannot understand why a government that is completely Islam-orientated could be so blind and did not notice that hidden infiltration. I can only explain it because of the merging of various facts beside those already mentioned. What we also have to know is, during the independence movement, Indonesians composed some more or less 40 patriotic songs. These guys had been educated at Dutch church music institutions. Primitive and often misunderstood Western tonal music language was used to set martial texts as well as the usual glorification of war and blood into music. So this is one of the things. And the second, before I show you a music example of that, the national government, at least since Suharto times, was convinced that what is successful in the West shall also be the benchmark for Indonesia. So let's find the Indonesian Michael Jackson. And that led to music. Sorry. Oh, wake up. So, yeah, we had some problems with the music examples, but I hope it works now. This was Maju Tak guitar, means go forward, don't shiver. That's a very martial attitude. Still in 1992, a musicologist could publish an article in the most famous daily newspaper, Kompas, saying the music culture of Indonesia, which is distributed over the whole archipelago, is the so-called traditional music, with low productivity and only a few ideas. Improvisation is an important and common element of that music. All seems to be quite amateur-like. All resembles an ethnic mosaic that is rooted in shamanism. It seems to be necessary to develop a new consciousness where the ethnic traditional music is reserved for tourism, while the occupation with classical and Western music shall contribute to strengthen our nation in a global competition. End of the quote. I think it doesn't need further explanations. Since the early 1990s, and together with some Indonesian friends, we finally partly succeeded, because of many accidental happenings, to get some influence on the national music education. And today, at least local music traditions play a certain role within Western music in the national music education. Considering all those circumstances, including the continuous dichotomies between myth and reality, one may hardly believe that a prosperous and creative contemporary music life could develop at all, especially in a culture with oral tradition. But beside the uniqueness of the Balinese themselves, it could also be possible that such turmoil had a stimulating impact for artists. As I already mentioned, Bali is the strongest region in Indonesia, where a contemporary music has developed that is based on the gamelan tradition. And first I would like to demonstrate how such a development could take place within the music itself, provided that borrowing and transforming of existing musical material is a common practice in Bali. Let's start with an old ritual music of the so-called gamelan gambang. It looks like that. What you see here in this example, you have metal instruments who play a melody which is always in 3/5, and you have an accompaniment that is at 4/4 or 8/8, overlapping this 3/5 technique, and it sounds like that. I have now always to jump. Sorry about it. It's the eight figuration. Stop it here. So this is the historical, one of the oldest Balinese music from East Bali. And then there was in the 20s a composer called Wayan Lodring who thought, from this ritual music we could make a more secular version. And so he took the type of melody, this 3/5, and he took also the way of repetitive figuration, and he created a very famous piece called, like this is the gamelan gambang, he called it gambangan, playing like gambang. And that sounds like that. That's the introduction. So that's what he did. He just transformed it into the secular context and adapted it for another type of gamelan. There are various variations of this 5/3/5 or the 5/3 model. One of the interesting thing is what happened if you go back for a short time to the notation. If you see here in the bam ba ba bam 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 ba ba bam, oh, it should go continue here. But for me, it's important here the additional part, which bam, it's all in the offbeat. Ba 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 da da ba 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 da da ba 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 da da. This rhythmic model. There was then another composer called Wayan Brata, and he made this. He shifted it a 16th just back to the beat, and it was not ba 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 da da. It became bam bam ba bi dam bim bam ba ba bam. So it's exactly the offbeat version of that figuration, which then became the main melody. That's typical way how they use their own material and transform it into something new. Just to let you know how that piece sounds. Okay, so you see here also the melody 3/5 started again. The next piece from Wayan Brata, I play you and you may guess what the important thing here is. What I call the foreign influences. He just quotes the wall style. If you may recall that the whole Balinese music so far was binary, 2, 4, 8, 16, etc. This was a revolution, that piece, when even the gong structure was in 3, 3, 3. And he told me, the composer, that the gong player had the most difficulties. It's an easy part, but he was so used to the binary, that would be something interesting for you, for example, that he was going mad with the ternary gong structure. But I think it's a very good adaptation of the wall style into the Balinese gamelan. Yeah? So that's what I meant before with this ability to transform something from outside, and that it's not something alien, it's something which is really integrated then in the new musical language. Another piece from Newman Winder, sorry. It's, I'll try to show you first the example. This was composed in 1997, it's a big cycle called Chatur Yuga. This is the piece Tana. And what you see here, for example, he dismisses the complete hierarchy in the gamelan and makes kind of chamber music-like setting, like here. And even here you have a kind of imitation with an augmentation in other instruments. So it's a really highly constructed composition where he did get all these influences. If there are influences, I can't say. I discussed that a lot with him, but he couldn't give me a comprehensive answer. He just said, yeah, I did it like that. So fine, good, I like that. Let's listen to it now. So much about Newman Winder. Oh, no, we don't like it again. Then another piece from a more recent composer, Mari Arnauer. He was quite influenced by minimal music, and he works a lot with shifting patterns, also completely ignoring the traditional hierarchy. What you see here is a 6-beat pattern overlapping with a 5-beat pattern, and that means if they repeat, it's always different in the way how they get together. This is something which you find a lot in the music of Terry Riley, for example. He has used that technique. I'll play you the end of the piece. Tell you when it starts, so you can see it for yourself. Okay, I must apologize. I have to speed up a little. Last example from Lebaketut Alit, one of the most advanced composers in Bali. He's from the Tudamani group and has now developed his own gamelan group, Salukat. And this piece, he deals mostly with the different scales and had even created new scales in Balinese music. And I would like to play you one of his recent pieces called Garagel. And that sounds like that. Okay, just so far. This was my last example. I hope I was able to show you a very complex culture between myth and realities, but apparently a culture that although there are all these problems of political influences and circumstances, but finally we have this kind of contemporary music development, which is quite amazing for me, and I think it's a fascinating example that probably, I said that in the middle of my lecture, especially this turmoil has also triggered creativity in a way. How that works, I can't say, but I think it's still fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dieter. I forgot to mention when I introduced